If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. This week and every week on Biblical Anarchy, we seek to live counterculture to the empire of man and to instead seek the kingdom of God by unpacking what the Bible teaches about government, authority, and human relationships. I am your host, Jacob Winograd. Today, I'm excited to present to you a segment from a conversation I had about concept of self-ownership with Kerry Baldwin, founder of Mere Liberty and LCI staff member. So what is self-ownership? Simply put, it's the idea that the individuals own themselves and have a right to make decisions about their own lives. This means that no one else can rightfully claim ownership over another person's body or mind. Now, you might be wondering how this pertains to children and their relationships with their parents and society. Well, according to libertarian legal theory, and also children are also self-owners from the moment of their birth, and they have the same inherent rights as adults, including the right to make decisions about their own lives. But of course, this doesn't mean that children should be left entirely on their own. Parents have a responsibility to care and guide their children until they're capable of making decisions for themselves. However, this guidance should be done in a way that respects the child's autonomy and does not violate their inherent rights as a self-owner. So how does this work? Well, that's exactly what Kerry and I dive into here. I'll be playing the first 20 minutes of our conversation, which gets into the definitions and the theory. If you want to check out the full episode where we explore different hypotheticals and also current events and legislation that's related to this topic, the link to the full conversation will be in the episode description. With that said, I will leave you to go watch this 20-minute segment, and I hope you enjoy it. So tonight we're going to be talking about kind of a lot of different things, but all relating to the idea of self-ownership. So some of this is going to be kind of like reviewing Libertarianism 101, but then we're talking about some kind of important areas where sort of like issues that we as Christians care about overlap with the considerations that come from the libertarian idea of self-ownership, and where people might have questions or concerns about how this interacts, especially when it comes to parents and their children. So we're going to get into that a little bit later in the stream. This has actually been, again, we don't plan these things ahead, but like this live stream ended up happening after a live stream I did yesterday on someone else's show, where I was debating for 3 hours and was being pressed hard on self-ownership. So this is actually good to kind of like recap it and talk about it, because it is the foundation, I think, of libertarian legal theory. So we need to understand what it is. Let's start with that, just defining what the concept of self-ownership is and what implications there are, just immediately apparent of it.
Yeah, so the libertarian principle of self-ownership is fairly simple. It's the idea that you have the highest claim on your body than anybody else. Now, this is fairly obvious, I think, to non-Christians. For Christians, what comes up immediately is, well, doesn't God own us? And yes, we acknowledge that God owns us. I'm going to actually read from our Reformed Libertarians statement on, on self-ownership and property rights, just so that everybody can hear how we define that on Reformed Libertarians. So it reads, all humans are created by God, and so he is every person's owner. God in Christ is the creator and owner of all things. Reference Colossians 1:15-17. At the same time, having created humans in his image, God has given each person a stewardship over themselves and their property. In relation to other humans, we call each person's stewardship their self-ownership. And this self-ownership can be extended to acquisition of ownership in scarce resources. Ownership is the right to exclusive control, use, or disposal of a resource. We call this property rights in one's person and things. And we cross-reference Exodus 21:16, Matthew 20:15, and Acts 5:4. And so this is the basis for one's civil and political right. So just sort of briefly, how we as human beings, as individuals, relate to God is different from how we relate to each other. And that's one major distinction for Christians to realize when they're conceptualizing self-ownership. We shouldn't confuse God's ownership of us as a negation of our self-ownership in relation to others. And I'll just say one more thing to that point. I've seen many non-libertarian Christians reject self-ownership as if this is some sort of license to be selfish or greedy or licentious, or that, those sorts of things. But that simply just fails to address the actual concept.
Yeah, so I think that's a good summary of self-ownership, and I agree. Even the guy I was debating last night, agreed that self-ownership. Like if you're going to be libertarian, self-ownership and the non-aggression principle, those are sort of the foundations of it. So going from that, we can start getting into, you sort of already handled with some of the questions Christians might have, like, well, can we own ourselves if we belong to God, and what is the implications there? Another question that might be worth talking about is in terms of like, what are possible are there limitations to this ownership? And then are we all equal at all points of our life in our ability to exercise, self-ownership, and, especially the, as it's pertaining to kids, right? Because the idea is if you own yourself and therefore you have the right to do with your body as you please, well, then I think maybe one of the first things that will come to mind is, well, then, like, what about children? Do they own themselves? And if we're saying no, is that a potential contradiction in the term or the theory itself? Rothbard had a way of trying to handle this, which is one of the few instances where I think Rothbard got it really wrong. I don't know if you want to summarize Rothbard's view. From what I can remember, it's kind of essentially almost like parents don't have any obligations towards their offspring and could just, shouldn't like actively initiate violence against them, but it can essentially neglect them to the point of letting them starve and die, or at least be, in a state of perpetual neglect and malnourishment and stuff. So, what are your thoughts on all this?
Well, just briefly, as far as that's concerned, what Rothbard was trying to avoid was this idea that the state could create positive rights. And I think he's right about that, but I think the reasons why he's right have nothing to do with this thing with children. So I'll come back to that in a second. But to answer the first question about limitations, self-ownership entails the natural limitations that are commensurate with being human. I make the argument with pregnancy that a woman has a right to choose not to become pregnant until she's pregnant. Then she's naturally limited, right? She has a baby growing in her. She no longer has that choice to not become pregnant. She already is. So she's naturally limited by that. For children, this also involves their human development. So both Rothbard and Hoppe tried to make this argument that children were only potential self-owners, or they weren't full self-owners. And both of them had some sort of, arbitrary, for Rothbard, it was if when the child is capable of running away from his parents, that's when he has full self-ownership. And Hoppe's argument was, well, when the child is capable of saying no, well, that's when they have, because that's their first, according to them, acts of agency. And so now they have full self-ownership. So I actually disagree with both of them on this, and argued that self-ownership is established from the moment conception is complete. So we are full self-owners, but the ability to exercise the rights associated with that are naturally limited based on human development. So obviously there's a natural limitation to a fetus, to an infant, to a toddler, to a child, to an adolescent. But also over time, what they're doing is they are developing the capacity for what Mises called human action. So I would say you are a self-owner from the moment conception is complete, but you are developing the capacity for human action, which once you've fully developed it into an adult, then you have that. We can dive into more if you want on that, but I'll pause there for a second.
Hey guys, just interrupting here for a second. I hope you're enjoying this. Before you get back to it, I just wanted to remind you that LCI is a nonprofit, which means that we operate mostly from donations from listeners and supporters such as you. So a couple things you can do to help us out so that we can keep creating great content like this. First of all, wherever you're watching, if you can and subscribe if it's on YouTube, or if you're on like Apple or Spotify, if you can leave a 5-star review or even a written review with it, that really helps us with the algorithms and just getting better ratings and helping us out there. Also, I would encourage you to become an LCI insider, and you can do that by going to biblicalanarchypodcast.com and then clicking the donate link and signing up as a monthly donor of $10 or more a month. And that'll get you access to all sorts of extra perks, discounts on merchandise, and early access to books, which LCI has got some stuff in the works. So check all that out. And other than that, I'll just get back into the show. Right. No. So I wonder if an apt comparison or analogy, like let's say something unfortunate happens, like your parents pass away and their life insurance policy, pays out a certain amount of money. Well, you might be the payee in that case.
Yeah,
but if you're like the beneficiary, but if you're 3 years old, you wouldn't be immediately just given that money, like a blank check or a stack of bills to use. The money would be put into some kind of trust.
Right.
There'd be a trustee who would be like the steward of that to hold and manage till you became of the age that you could actually inherit and own it. But you would still, in a legal sense, be the owner of that initial sum, so to speak.
Yeah, the child is the owner of that inheritance, but they are not developmentally capable of exercising their rights concerning it, and so there's a trustee who's put in place, and the trustee their job specifically is to act in the interest of the child. So
right, and like the trustee, because like ownership would imply the ability to control and to exclude, and the trustee doesn't have ownership rights. They can't trade away the inheritance or the payout or anything. They're very limited in what they can do in a legal sense. So I think it's a good comparison as far as that goes. Because I know some libertarians who try to square this come they get into weird stuff like children are self-owners, therefore and this is tough because I kind of believe in somewhat of a I don't like the term gentle parenting or peaceful parenting, because there's a lot of people that use those terms, but a lot of libertarians will do this. They're like, it's like, oh, they're self-owners, so like you're asking your 2-year-old, can I change your diaper please? And
well, yeah. So this is interesting because we're talking about limitations. Limitations, interestingly enough, I would say are not quite they're not determined by parents, but they are assessed by parents, right? So let's take this diaper changing analogy for a minute. Parents are in the best position to assess whether their child has developed the ability to have some agency, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, a parent can assess that an infant is incapable of cleaning its own butt after pooping in a diaper, right? So
Right.
the parents have a responsibility with also a corresponding right to be the ones to do this. They can hire some sort of caretaker, but they are responsible for finding a good caretaker. But they have a responsibility to change the infant's diaper and clean his bottom. They may, like I said, entrust this to a caretaker, but then they're responsible for finding somebody who's a quality caretaker and isn't going to violate the child's rights, which would be horrendous in this case. But once the child is potty trained, for example, the child takes control of that. And barring extenuating circumstances like, some sort of health compromise, it would actually be inappropriate for the parent to be doing this task for an older and capable child. So we can actually see how the development of the child moves, and changes over time, and how that affects their agency and their ability to do things for themselves, and when that becomes inappropriate for parents to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. To go to the other extreme, example that might be a question that comes to mind. So we're saying that parents do have a responsibility towards their children. You've made the argument for why this doesn't create positive rights, which is what Rothbard and other libertarians are concerned about. But then, is there a legal responsibility that can be enforced by a libertarian legal theory if there's not a positive right or obligation? Like, what would that look like? So can, in a libertarian sense, can some agency of law be used to prosecute parents who do harmful things to their children? I mean, I think most everyone would agree that if you actually physically harm your child, that would be prosecutable. What if it? I mean, are there? And this can be tough, right? Because I know horror stories about parents who have struggled with being falsely reported by CPS and things like that for things that didn't happen, including in my time in the Libertarian Party by other supposed libertarians. I had a friend of mine who, just because she voted one way, had these vengeful people call CPS on her, which was just awful. And so we don't want that. But at the same time, if we're going to say that Rothbard's wrong in that parents do have obligations to take care of their children that are natural, is there a point where the law can or should be utilized to enforce this?
Yeah. So one of the differences between Rothbard and I is that I argue that natural obligations are created on the parents as a consequence of their action in creating a new human, a new self-owner, right? So none of us, first of all, this is one of the problems with this whole conversation is that everybody wants to analogize it, right? Everybody wants to, make it like Block, for example, makes it analogous to a landlord-tenant relationship, and I've got plenty of content explaining why that analogy doesn't work. But fundamentally, it doesn't work because every human being comes into existence this way. So it's actually something that's normative, and we should be deducing normativity from it rather than trying to analogize it. So every single human being comes into existence because a man and a woman came together and had sexual relations, right? So that means that none of us have a choice to come into existence. Even if our parents planned, expected, and wanted to produce children, we ourselves did not have the choice to come into existence. So since this is also normative, it naturally entails a claim or proprietary interest in the parents by the offspring to provide for that child until they're developmentally capable of providing for themselves. Now, as far as specifics like what's enforceable by civil governance, I would say that is food and shelter, which is evidenced by the placenta and umbilical cord, what those do, which is provide food and shelter, and also to some degree self-defense by way of just the womb, right? The fact that a baby is developing inside the mother's body is a matter of protection. But also, having self-ownership means I have the right to self-defense, right? And if a fetus has self-ownership, they have the right to self-defense, but they don't have the developmental capacity to exercise self-defense, which means that the parents are on the hook for providing for that. Now, they can provide for it themselves, or they can find a suitable alternative, which, the obvious thing with that is adoption. But, things that don't really fall under that, I wouldn't say are enforceable by civil governance. For example, you need to provide food, but exactly what kind of food is much more arbitrary. Now, so what may fly under the banner of what's in the best interest of the child may be prudential, may be moral, may be ideal, but it's not necessarily coercively enforceable. So we have to, we have to start drawing those distinctions. The purpose of civil governance is only one thing, right? It's not to be the moral enforcer of the ideal, which is how we operate currently in our society, which is ironic because the enforcer of the ideal is like ruining children's lives right now. So deciding what food to feed your child is not something the civil magistrate should determine. Now, say you live in this, anarchist society, a community may eventually come to the conclusion that feeding your child a high sugar diet is poisoning them and harming their development. And now that we have that knowledge, maybe that becomes something that's coercively enforceable. If somebody is doing that, that brings up the question of negligence. And I did some research on this and came across an article from Stephan Kinsella, who says that the idea of negligence as a legal aspect of libertarianism isn't really well developed. And I think he's probably right about that. But one of the things that he says is that when it comes to negligence comes in degrees. So if it's 100% negligence, or 100% intentional, then it's criminal, right? But let's say you have negligence that come in varying degrees from 10 to 90%. Well, then the legal response has to be proportional, whatever that is. And I imagine that negligence would have to come with some sort of consistency so that we're not punishing every single stupid little mistake that parents make, because that would be everything. Right? Parents screw up all the time and make mistakes, and completely unintentionally. They're not trying to neglect their child. So we wouldn't want that to get wrapped up into that. So at any rate, the idea of negligence probably needs to be developed quite a bit. But, unless you could prove, I would say, some intention to violate a child's rights, to starve them or poison them, or, something to that effect with food, or by intentionally depriving them with food, unless they're doing something like that, then you wouldn't get the state wouldn't, or the civil magistrate wouldn't get involved with that. It may be something that your church gets involved with or your family gets involved with, but it would just be a nonviolent solution.
All right, everyone. Well, I hope that was informative. I hope that helped gives you a little bit of understanding on how the libertarian conception of self-ownership pertains to individuals, including children, how parents play an important role in that, and sort of how that gets hashed out in a way that doesn't lead to sort of like doomsday scenarios or sort of outcomes that we would not want as Christians. And so the libertarian conception of self-ownership is commensurate with Christian principles and actually helps us to uphold the sphere of the family, which is one of the most fundamental building blocks of society and one of the most important spheres in the Christian worldview. So if you want to watch the full episode, again, that link will be in the description for this episode. But that's all I have for you guys for this week. I look forward to talking to you again next week. Until then, live at peace and live for Christ. Take care.
The Biblical Anarchy Podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.